Welcome to Windows on the World. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're going to be talking about heresy. Yes, heretic. The word heretic actually goes back to the Greek, and its original root means able to choose. So people who are heretics are people who are able to choose. At certain periods of history, the ability to choose has not been granted. So we're in very similar times now. We're going to be talking about heresy in the Middle Ages, the time of Henry VIII up until Mary I. And hundreds of people were burnt at the stake in a place in London called Smithfield. They were burnt all over the country, but Smithfield was the chosen place of execution for heretics. And during the time of Henry VIII to Mary I, hundreds were burnt, at least 65 in Smithfield. The numbers are probably higher than that. And if you go to Smithfield, you'll see a little plaque. And that plaque was put up by the Protestant Alliance. Now, not all of the heretics burnt in Smithfield were Protestants. In fact, some of them were Catholics. Some of them were evangelical Christians called Anabaptists. So it wasn't just Protestants who were burnt at the stake during the Reformation. It depended on what was happening. When Henry VIII made himself head of the church, for instance, then a lot of the Catholic priests went against Henry, and this caused their further problems. So it's a very interesting time. We're going to be talking about the Smithfield Martyrs, and it's a project that I've been working on for a number of years. I started to go into Smithfield, looking around, started to do some research, and that's resulted in a documentary that we're putting out called The Heretics of London, the Smithfield Martyrs. So I'm joined by Eric von Essex tonight, and we're going to talk a little bit about Smithfield and about this idea of heresy, what happened during the reign of Henry VIII to Mary I, and a bit of the history of Smithfield, which actually goes back at least 1,000 years. Smithfield in London was originally called the Smoothfield. So, Chris, you've been catching up with a bit of this today.
That's right. I know very little about it, and it's a very interesting subject. So, I'm here to learn because my sort of history is modern history, which is First World War, Second World War, and that type of thing. And when I was at school, I used to nod off to sleep.
Well, history's not really been taught very well in school.
It's totally boring.
Yeah, totally boring. So I remember going into history lessons when I got into the third year of the secondary school, which was basically when you left your primary school, you went into a secondary school, and that was basically I think it was a comprehensive, not a grammar school, but it was quite a good one, quite a good school. But the history teacher was paint-dryingly boring. And the other problem about history is that the way they teach it does not seem to have a linear timeline. It seems to go all over the place, and you get bits and pieces of things, and you never really get any continuity. That was the problem I had with it, because they cover certain aspects of history, but leave a lot of really interesting stuff out. For instance, all this stuff about that happened in the Middle Ages and the heresy with the church, and basically the burning of heretics has been pretty much wiped out of history. If you go to Smithfield, you'll see a little plaque there by the William Wallace plaque, because of course William Wallace, the Scottish heretic or traitor, depends which side you were on at the time, because Wallace was executed there in 1305, I think. But the actual burning of heretics goes back to 1401, and we're going to go into that tonight. But there's a little plaque there, and it was put up by the Protestant Alliance about 70 years ago. And you've got three names on it: John Rogers, John Philpott, and John Bradford, who succumbed to the flames only a few feet from where the plaque was. Now, we actually found out where the stake was. We found an old book that came out. Well, it's not an ancient book, but it came out in the 1950s, and it was called Hidden London. And in there was a photograph of where the martyrs' stake in Smithfield was actually found in 1849. They dug up the road to do some road works, and there's a photograph where it's marked. Now, in our film, we've actually got that. We've marked the spot, and we actually have the heretics walking out to where they were actually burned as ghosts. And we filmed it all in Smithfield in daylight. And we managed to get around the fact that those taxi drivers there having their lunch and all the rest, who were looking on a bit bemused. And we've actually finished all the filming now, but we actually focused on a few characters because so many heretics were burned there. Were you aware of any of this, Chris?
No, I wasn't. I knew about. I thought he was Australian. I'm only joking. Sorry, William Wallace from the film Braveheart. But I used to actually work in an office not that far from Smithfield and walk past there every morning, and I wasn't aware of it at all. So I'm really here to learn. I'm very interested because the amount of gruesome torture that went on in those days. And what amazed me, I did a little bit of research on this before we came on air. When they did a burning, it was bring the children. It was a sort of a fun day out.
Well, the thing about it was that burnings were very unpopular because these people became martyrs. And the whole intention of this law that came in 1401, it was called Heretico Bendo, which was an ecclesiastical law. The Holy Roman Church, the Holy Roman Empire, the Catholic Church, the Universal Church brought in. And it was basically to deter people from heresy. Now, we have to define what heresy actually is, according to the Catholic Church. The heresy, which most of the heretics were burned for, was denying that transubstantiation occurred and that the bread and wine administered in the Mass did not turn into the literal flesh and blood of Jesus Christ. So if you didn't believe that bread and wine turned into Jesus, you were a heretic. Now, there was ways of arguing around this, and a lot of the heretics argued very successfully with these examinations. But in 1401, they brought in Heretico Bendo. And in 1401, guess what? The first heretic was burned in Smithfield the same year that Heretico Bendo was issued and brought into the ecclesiastical law. Now, canonical law became aligned with common law because what happened was heresy was a common law offence. So basically, what happened was that you would be examined by the church. You would be called in, you would be taken to an examination with people like Thomas Cranmer or Edmund Bonner. Edmund Bonner was the Bishop of London. Cranmer was actually a reformist, but Bonner was a Catholic. So it got very mixed up when Henry VIII changed, because basically when he put in the Act of Supremacy in 1534, made himself head of the church, then things changed quite a bit. But basically, we were still under the power of Rome. And that's where these laws came from. So Heretico Bendo, the same year, William Sawtrey, a priest from Lynn in Norfolk, was burnt at the stake. And he basically went against transubstantiation. They had a lot of spies out at this time. So basically, there would be people in your congregation who would be looking for the Roman Church to see if you were putting out anything that they didn't like. And that got reported back to the Crown. And it got reported back to the ecclesiastical courts. So it's a very interesting thing that Heretico Bendo was canonical law, but it was brought into common law through a writ issued by the Crown. So the Crown would burn you for heresy, but you would be brought to the attention of the church authorities through Heretico Bendo. But basically, it made burning a common law offence. So heresy was a common law offence in that respect, even though they were arguing against an ecclesiastical concept, which was that the transubstantiation, the Eucharist, when administered by a priest, literally became the flesh and blood of Jesus Christ. If you went against that, and you said you were against that, you would be burned at the stake. And that was one of the main issues that the heretics had, which they argued against, some of them quite successfully. But Sawtrey said things like pilgrimages to Rome would be better off, the money would be better spent from pilgrimages by helping the poor. He said, I adore the Christ, not the cross on which he died. Yeah. So he said, I adore Jesus Christ, but I do not worship a wooden cross. So that was heretical as well. You had to worship the crucifix. So there was a lot of things here that the reformists didn't like. The reformists were called lollards, which came from a Dutch word which meant to mumble. because a lot of them were very obsessive people, and they went around mumbling under their breath with prayers, and they carried them what was called Tyndale's Bible. There was two writers of the Bible, John Wycliffe and William Tyndale. This was between 13 to late 1400s. And Tyndale's Bible was what the heretics of the 1500s carried around with them. If you were caught with one, then you could be taken in and you would be charged with a distribution of heretical books. So there was a big battle to get the Bible in front of the people. So it was a battle for the Bible. So the priest class did not want the public reading the Bible. Women weren't allowed to proselytize in public. And that's where one of our characters in our film, Anne Askew, was burned when she was 26. She's a really interesting character, fascinating in retrospect when you look at what's happening now. Let's take it forward a bit to the Act of 6 Articles in 1539, which actually brought into law the heresy. In other words, if you denied the Eucharist to be the flesh and blood of Christ, it was then a crown offence. And that was called the Act of 6 Articles. The Act of 6 Articles was formally known, the formal title for the Act of 6 Articles in 1539 was an act abolishing diversity in opinions. What do you think of that?
Well, I can see a lot of similarities with today.
Yeah.
Because this climate change cult is a religion.
Yeah. It's a religion, yeah.
And I can imagine that in Smithfield, or when a person was done for heresy in those days, they would be laughed at. They would be ridiculed as some sort of loony. Oh, you know, and the similarities are quite breathtaking with today, because when you see these so-called experts in climate change, I saw one on YouTube. It was an Australian equivalent of Question Time, BBC Question Time, and it was Brian Cox with and there was a chap, a senator on there. I think you know,
Malcolm Roberts, Senator Malcolm Roberts, yes. And
Malcolm Roberts was just said, well, you know, he questions this climate change. He said, and he just said the NASA statement was incorrect. And then Cox went straight in and said, "Oh, so I suppose you deny them landing on the moon, do you?" And
I'd like to delineate here a bit, because I think what's happened now is things have become more dumbed down. Having studied this stuff about the heresy, it was a much more intellectual argument these people had. But basically, transubstantiation was the line you couldn't cross. Once you crossed that line, you were in big trouble. So, because it took away the power of the priest. So, in other words, if you didn't believe that their priests could administer the bread and wine, and it would actually become the flesh and blood of Jesus Christ, then you were going against the priest class, and you're not allowed to do that. So that's where it was very interesting. And this idea of an act abolishing diversity in opinion, it is very similar to now. But what I would say is that then the people were arguing from a much more intellectual base, and they were very clever in argument. I've read some of the court records, especially if you read the examinations of Anne Askew, who was only 26 when she was burned in Smithfield, and she was illegally tortured in the Tower of London. Now, what's interesting about this, Chris, as well, is that behind a lot of these burnings, there was machinations by the state. In other words, there were people who were behind the scenes doing very Machiavellian things. So a lot of these people had campaigns started against them. And maybe we can go into a few of those tonight. But yeah, we need to get a bit of an overview going first, because I don't want to jump in with too much detail. But yes, the idea of climate change as a religion and worshipping Mother Gaia is a new form of this, because anything outside it is deemed to be heresy. And heresy just merely means you are able to choose, you're able to have your own opinion. So the word heresy has been totally used by the church to demonize people who can think for themselves. Interesting, yeah.
It's all to do with power, isn't it? And when you think about it, I mean, supposing I winged it and I said, well, I'm an absolute expert on Smithfield, which I'm not, anything far from it. And you were noticing that I was talking a load of BS. the way I could switch that round is to just pick on anything minor and then start laughing at you and say, oh, this is ridiculous what you're saying, and kind of change the subject and push it away. And I noticed
well, even the third party subject, like if you believe that climate change doesn't, there's no climate change doesn't exist. Climate change happens all the time, but they've hijacked the term, you see. So what it is, it's a hijacking of language. Was what I found interesting was why you get people like Anne Askew. These people were incredibly well read. And what was interesting is we're not talking about idiots like Brian Cox here. These heretics were often lawyers, they were often priests and landed gentry. So we're not talking about commoners here. There was a few commoners burned, and some of the commoners who were burned were burned because they were quite ignorant, really, and they were kind of picked on. There's a boy that's actually left out. He was only 15, and he was a bit. It would be classed today probably as autistic or, you know, though he had some mental problems, and they burned him, you see. Now, the thing is that Heretico Coram Bendo was brought in 1401 to basically deter people from disagreeing with the church. They would make an example of them, to burn them in public so that nobody would dare to do it. So what it was about was a form of trauma through mind control. So the idea was that they would burn people publicly and everyone go, God, I don't want that to happen to me. But what happened was the opposite, which is why it's fascinating. These people became heroes, and the huge crowds would come, and the crown would be basically shouted down by the reformers. So what happened was it turned against the church, because the people then became martyrs. So in 1568, which is quite a long time after this, a book came out called Fox's Book of Martyrs, Acts and Monuments of the Protestant Church. And although it's a little bit exaggerated, and he gives Friar Forrest, who's one of our characters, he was a Franciscan monk, an observant monk, and he kind of goes, oh, he was cowardly and he was trying to escape from the flames and all this. But so there's a bit of propaganda in there on the side of the Protestants, but it's generally, he had the court record. So Fox's Book of Martyrs is what we cover in the film, even though there's hundreds of people in there, and it's very detailed. But what's interesting is that you get an insight into the power of the language that people were using. And it was way beyond what people do today. Like Anne Askew, if you read the examinations of Anne Askew, and she wrote several songs in prison as well. And we have the girl who plays Anne Askew sings them in the film. We've actually put them to music, to 15th century music with musicians. It's very powerful stuff. And there's two songs in it. She does one called "I Am a Woman Poor and Blind," and there's one called "The Ballad of Anne Askew," which she wrote in prison. And both of those are in the film. But when you read what she was saying, she was highly complex in her thinking. And what it was, there's a basic difference between the way the ecclesiastical church were thinking and the way the reformers were thinking. So the reformers were basically, the Lutherans were saying, basically, the Bible is for everyone. We don't believe in idolatry. We worship Jesus Christ, but we don't worship the cross. We do not believe that transubstantiation can be a supernatural event. But the bread and wine remains bread and wine. And a lot of them would say things like, well, there's a question that Anne Askew gets asked. So what if a church mouse eats the Eucharist? In other words, eats the bread of the Eucharist. She just went, lucky mouse. So they were kind of being very clever the way they answered things. And these examinations went on for months at a time. It's very, very interesting. What they would do is they'd get them to try and recant, because you'd have to be a relapsed heretic to be burned. So you had 3 chances, basically. You had to be arrested 3 times for it. And if you abjured, then you were considered to be let off. But the abjuration was that you would be basically publicly humiliated in a church. And that was too much for a lot of these people. So they would sign a confession that they were wrong, the Roman Church was right, transubstantiation happens, and the priest class of the Holy Roman Empire were indeed the real priest class. What happened after that was that they would go away and go, oh, God, I wish I hadn't done that. They'd have attacks of conscience. Now, that's what makes it interesting, because it was about belief. It was about the belief that these people had that made them so extreme, which is why I found it so interesting, because they were given a chance to be let off. Even at the stake, they could abjure. They were still interrogated for about an hour at the stake. and then they would have to be kind of, with the priests it was slightly different. The priests were degraded, which meant that they would have all their priestly goods taken off them, and then they would have their robe ripped and they'd be made to keep it on in prison, so they went very dirty, and then they'd put a commoner's cap on them. It was like and then if it was a Catholic priest, they would be knocked down the altar steps backward with the staff. So it was a reversal of the of basically the exercise in becoming a priest. It was the reversal of induction into the priesthood. So they would knock them down the steps, and some of them banged their head on the foot. It's really kind of dramatic stuff, and the whole thing behind it is fascinating, because it was about belief. It was about the fact that they couldn't live with themselves, so they would rather be burned to death, which is why I found it so fascinating. And some of them were completely set up, basically. Yeah.
What did any of them top themselves to commit suicide rather than being burnt to death?
A very funny one. If you look at this, Richard Hunn was one of the first people to be convicted of heresy, and he was put into what they call Lollard's Tower. They had two of them, and if you were a Lollard, which was basically a heretical Protestant, they put you into Lollard's Tower. There was one in Westminster, and there was one near the Tower of London, and they were like holding places. Now, Richard Hunn had a lot of stuff that he knew about what was going on within the church, and he was found hanged in his cell, a bit like Epstein, I suppose, right? But obviously he was a bit more honourable than Epstein, probably. But the point is that how do you get hanged in your own cell? Do you know what I mean? He couldn't have committed suicide. So basically, what happened with Richard Hunn, if you look him up, was that he was kind of set up. There was things going on behind him. A Machiavellian operation was in place, and he was killed because of what he knew. He was hung in his own cell when he was at Lollard's Tower, and then they burned his dead body in Smithfield, and then they actually abdicated himself. He was abdicated from his own murder. So in other words, he was kind of, they let him off his own murder. So they said, in other words, they were saying that, no, he didn't really commit suicide after all, but we can't say that, you know. So there was an incredible amount of kind of Machiavellian stuff going on behind the scenes. And that, with the case of Friar Forrest, who was burned in Smithfield in 1539, the Franciscan monk, he was actually based in round Gravesend, I think, and he was against Henry remarrying, and he said that the Pope is in Rome and the Pope is the head of the church, and he wrote a book about Henry, and he kept writing it in prison, Friar Forrest. And Friar Forrest was set up. There were people around him who were basically very jealous of him. If you read what's going, it's kind of interesting, because he was kind of set up, and they actually burned him in Smithfield in 1539 on top of a statue of a Welsh warrior god called Derfel Gadarn. And Derfel Gadarn was from a place in North Wales called Llandderfel. Now, I read about Derfel Gadarn. They took the statue, which was in Llandderfel Church in Wales. They dragged it all the way to Smithfield. Allegedly, this thing was 8 foot tall, and it was in the churchyard of Llandderfel Church. And every May they had Derfel Day. Derfel the Mighty was a Welsh warrior. Basically, he was a mythical Welsh warrior. And the story goes that he put down his sword and started healing people. So they have Derfel's Day, and all the villagers would come from miles around to the churchyard, and they would put fruit there and things, and bring their children, their sick children, to be healed by the statue. So it was on a pilgrimage route. So the church really didn't like it. So what they decided to do was make an example not only of Friar Forrest, but of Derfel Gadarn. And the story behind Derfel Gadarn is that one day Derfel Gadarn will rise up and set a forest on fire, right? And ironically, Friar Forest was on fire on top of Derval Gaddon statues. It's the statue in Smithfield. So it's kind of very strange, the whole thing. So it was symbolic, but the idea was, and this is how stupid it is in a way, intellectually, that they thought that the supernatural element of Derval Gaddon was in the statue. Well, of course it wasn't. The statue is just a symbol. So they burned the symbol to try and to try and prove to the crowd that, see, your pagan god, it's just a piece of wood.
But
and poor old Friar Forest was burned to death on top of this pagan statue. He was swung into the flames on chains, you know, because they didn't all die. It was a different kind of execution. So they built these big stages in Smithfield, which the City of London paid for. And that's another reason why I think I had a bit of problem trying to get hold of a lot of the court records, because I went to the Metropolitan Archive and they were rather cagey about showing me stuff. They call it the Middlesex Sessions. And it was very, very difficult to get hold of things. Then a couple of years ago, a book came out called The Burning Time, which was written by a woman who was on the Privy Council of the City of London. And she seems to have had access to stuff I couldn't find. So I got some stuff from her. And then I started finding out that the Derval Gaddon story is quite big. And our talk in Fairbourne in North Wales a few weeks ago, we actually had a fella there who he thinks is the reincarnation of Derval Gaddon, Lawrence Main's name. He's a good writer. And he supplied me with some more stuff about Derval Gaddon. It's fascinating, the whole era. Once you tie into one of these stories, you tie into such an intriguing lineage of facts and information that it's very hard to stop researching it, which is why I put so much time into researching it, because when I went down there, first of all, I knew that there was some supernatural element behind it as well with what was with that area. There's something about that area, and we can get into that as well, as to why Smithfield was chosen.
Wasn't it? I mean, I thought it was chosen because it was a place where there was a horse fair, and there was it was a place where people used to go to for trading and lots of fairs. And I thought they chose Smithfield, is what I read anyway, because they wanted people to congregate there and see these burnings to put them off of going against the priesthood and that. And I know they cut their heads off, didn't they? And shoved them on stakes.
Yeah,
and shoved.
It was used actually. There was a householder, someone who worked for the king, was burnt there. I think it was Henry VII. I think. I have to look this up. This is a bit before what I was researching, but he was a cook, and he got blamed for poisoning or attempting to poison the king and his household. But what had happened was something had gone off, obviously, and this poor chef had basically cooked a dodgy meal. It didn't kill anybody, but he got done with, I think it's called prémunire, which means like you're trying to take down the crown, and it's against the state. So basically, he was executed in Smithfield, but he wasn't burned. He was boiled to death in a pot. I mean, it's unbelievable what happened there, because he was boiled in a pot of oil in Smithfield. And where the Elms was, we made a film a few years ago, and it's called Ritual Sacrifice in London, Smithfield. And we found where the Elms were. The Elms were at the top of Smithfield. If people know Smithfield, it's there's a road called Cow Lane where they brought the cows in. And that's still there, and that goes into Smithfield Meat Market at the top of Smithfield. So what happened was they brought this they brought the cattle in, but the Elms was at the top of Smithfield as well, which is actually where the haberdashers' hall. Smithfield is fringed by Freemasonic halls. There's got the butchers, the grocers, haberdashers. And the haberdashers takes up one side of Smithfield, which is the opposite side to where the burnings were, which is by St. Bartholomew's Church. And that was the area where they used to have the hangings. So then they moved them to Tyburn, which was Speaker's Corner. And Speaker's Corner, the idea is people go to Speaker's Corner thinking that they've got free speech. No, it's not about that at all. Speaker's Corner was where you went to say your last words before you were executed. So it's not about freedom of speech. It means that your words at Speaker's Corner mean nothing because you're going to be executed. They're going to be lost in the wind. And that's why they call it Speaker's Corner. And the actual Tyburn tree where they hung them off was in the middle of the road there. It's where you go to Speaker's Corner. People know Marble Arch in London, in England. You go up from Marble Arch. There's a traffic island opposite Speaker's Corner when you're crossing. And there's a little plaque on it, and it says, here was the Tyburn tree. So that's just in the road there, yeah. And fascinating. They had several sites in Smithfield where they did the burnings. There's two. If you look at the woodcuts, it looks like there's two. There's one in front of St. Bartholomew's, which we found. The stake was dug up in 1849, and that's where we filmed. And I matched up from the original photograph where they found the stake and the charred bones. And we had the heretics walking towards that. So we've used that in the film. We've got the exact spot where most of them were burned. So, yeah, it's fascinating. Really fascinating little place.
Isn't it strange? It's all to do with, really, to sum it up in a word, it is an elite trying to keep elite and not wanting, especially that chap that translated the Bible from Latin so that the average person could understand it, because the priests wanted to keep their little secret. It must have been like a sort of, excuse the expression, a Freemasonry of his time in a way, because they wanted to keep their own little group. And they didn't want people finding out, because it lowered their power, didn't it? I mean, if you could read the Bible.
The thing about it was that it created martyrs. So it had the opposite effect. So Heretico Corrumbendo, 1401, was that so that it would be so publicly horrific that people would never go against the church. But it had the opposite effect. They became martyrs. And John Fox's Book of Martyrs clearly turns them all into martyrs. You know, and it starts off with, I find recorded in the registers of London the names of divers men and women, troubled, persecuted, and imprisoned by the cruel and bloody rage of the Catholic seat. And that's how it starts. But it wasn't all Protestants who were burned, as we've been saying. Friar Forrest was a monk, and he was kind of set up because he went against Henry VIII. So anyone who went, it depended whether Henry was deferring to Rome or whether it was after the Act of Supremacy in 1534. You see.
Weren't they brave, though? When you look at the bravery of these people, I mean, to go through that unbelievable, knowing that you're going to die a really horrendous death and still go ahead with it, it's a sort of bravery. Oh, wow, I mean...
Well, that's what I found fascinating about it, because...
admiration, incredible.
Yeah. If we can get on to, maybe if we go on to Annie Askew, because she was one of the most interesting, and also she should never have been tortured. She was tortured in the Tower of London. She was burned on the 16th of July, 1546. And she'd come to the attention of the authorities. She ran away from her husband. She was meant to, the man she was meant to marry, so her sister was meant to marry someone called Thomas Kyne, and the sister died. So this Thomas Kyne married Anne Askew, and she had 2 children, and she ran away. She was caught reading from the Bible in Lincoln Cathedral, which was absolutely heretic at the time. That was, a woman was not allowed to read from the Bible for a start, and doing it in public was just like, well, she was a complete rebel, you know. She was a fascinating person. And so she read from the Bible in Lincoln Cathedral. Then she went up to London, and she was part of a network of these Lollards, these reformists, including people like the crowd around William Tyndale, who translated the Bible. So she was in with these people who were a network of lawyers, people within the church, priests, and basically a network that went through to Antwerp. And in Antwerp, they were printing originally they were writing these Bibles out by hand. they had people within the church helping, which is very, very interesting. And they were distributing them over back in England. And Annie Askew was caught because she was associating with these people. Also, she was a very good friend of Catherine Parr. And Catherine Parr was a Protestant. And Annie Askew and Catherine Parr were alleged to be going round and holding Bible meetings and readings from the Bible, which was completely illegal. They weren't allowed to do it. So they were way ahead of their time as far as this feminism thing goes, because they were just completely cutting edge with what they were doing. And they were very young as well. I mean, Anne Askew was only 23, 24. She was burnt when she was 26. But she came up to London, and the first time she got sent back again. And then she ran away again. You had to be basically convicted 3 times to be burned as heretic, but you were allowed to abjure every time. But what happened with her was there was elements within the state who were trying to set up Catherine Parr, and Catherine Parr and her were extremely good friends, and they tortured Anne Askew illegally in the Tower of London for 2 days. Richard Rich, and there was a fella called John Bale, who was one of the prosecutors. The original magistrate walked out because he wouldn't torture her, and they put her on the rack and they dislocated a bone so she couldn't walk, and they were still trying to get her to abjure, which was basically a very long process, and she was made an example of because they were trying to implicate Catherine Parr. So they tortured Anne Askew, in my opinion, and looking at the history, so that she could basically grass up Catherine Parr. It was a coup against the crown.
She kept quiet, but they had to carry her to the stake or the place of execution in a chair because she was so badly tortured, wasn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
And we've got a girl who plays Anne Askew, and she's brilliant. And we've actually filmed her. She comes back obviously as a ghost, because it's modern times, but they all come back as ghost characters in the film. But her story is very, very interesting, and it was a big cover-up by the state, really, that it should have happened. And yeah, we tell the whole story. We have also in the film, we have Friar Forrest. Yeah, he was burned in 1538 on top of the statue of Derval Gadon. We have Joan Bocher, also known as Joan of Kent, who was burned in 1550. Now, she was an Anabaptist, and so she was an evangelical Christian, originally a Protestant, but she was part of a later group who were associated with people like Anne Askew. And in Thomas Cranmer's house, where she was being examined, we've actually filmed that. We have Thomas Cranmer in the film as well. And they're all very good actors. And basically, Joan Bocher would not abjure. She said, basically Cranmer says, well, if that is your belief, so be it. And so she was burned. But she actually says in her testimony, says, it's not long ago since you burnt Anne Askew for a piece of bread, and now you're going to do the same to me, meaning the Eucharist, of course. Which is really, I mean, the examinations of Anne Askew is very, very long, and it was done by John Bale, and it was actually smuggled out of the country. That's the interesting thing about it. It was published in Europe, but not here. And this is why there's resistance by the City of London to actually admit that any of this has happened, even though you go to the Freemasonic Hall outside there, right, the haberdashers, and there's some Freemasons going in and out, and they said, oh, what are you doing? Because they get very interested. They want to know what you're doing. We were filming a few years ago, this was. And I said, oh, we talked about the heretics, that were burned against. Oh, no one was burned here. They did it up the road. I mean, it's part of British history, don't it? It actually says so. If you go into St. Bart's, it says so. I mean, there's no secret about this stuff, but there's I think there's a willful ignorance about admitting it, because the City of London paid for the executions. So it's a kind of unpopular thing,
Well, it's a bit like Australians. Every Australian I've ever met that has never lived in a state that was a penal colony. Holiday. I've got the right teeth in. But no, it was, their relatives were never took over as criminals. They went there of their own volition. But actually, when you look at the executioners, that's rather interesting, because the executioners were generally hated. They were, their families went through it, and a lot of the executioners were actually murderers that were let off. And they said, "We will let you off provided you become an executioner." And sometimes that was worse because they were branded as well. And but when you look at the people that operated the rack and things like that, they must have been the most horrendous psychos ever. And let's face it, if you were a complete psychopath in those days, you could get some you could almost get assurance of employment, couldn't you? Really, they really took a lot of pride and happiness in their work, I would have thought.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, with the Anne Askew case, she said it was one of them was Richard Rich. Richard Rich was a lawyer, and he became part of Henry VIII's very close circle. But the interesting thing with Annie Askew was that her brother was a cupbearer to Henry VIII. Her father was High Sheriff of Nottingham, so they were kind of part of landed gentry, and they were in with the royals as well. So her case is very interesting, and that's why I think that she's been basically written out of history. Interestingly, at the back of Smithfield, at the back of St. Bartholomew's, they've put a new building up, and it's called the Askew Building, but it's not named after her. It's named after an investor, I think, called William Askew.
Well,
so it's not up to her. But when we filmed, we got the girl who plays Anne Askew in a 16th century costume outside there, reading her own examinations outside the building. So we've been filming around there a lot. And
did you feel people looking around saying, "What's going on here?"
Last time we were there, when we filmed Archbishop Cranmer, our actor Archbishop Cranmer, where Netflix were filming a massive thing there, but they were using it because it was very quiet. I think they weren't using it because of it particularly a good place, so they weren't making the most of the scenery. They were using it to one of the back streets as like a little setup. Sometime in Soho in the 50s, they had all these sort of go-go signs and stuff like that up. But we had tremendous problem filming down there because just about everywhere had a white van or a facilities truck in front of it. But we actually managed to do it. We got into the Rotunda Garden, which is in the middle of Smithfield. They've got this garden with a statue of this lady, and it's in the middle. And that was actually a place where the cattle market was years ago. And yeah, we filmed in there quite a lot because Smithfield is always been should be the most haunted place in London, really, because not only were there massive amount of plague pits around there and a cemetery, all of these people were burned there, and that the executions there, hundreds and hundreds of people were executed. And we could also go into St. Bartholomew's Church as well, which was founded in 1123 by the monk Rahir. And there's a great story about that, and it's really, I think it's been really propped up by the church to make it sound more interesting. But what the fascinating thing is about it is that the St. Bartholomew's the Great, the church there, was founded allegedly by this monk Rahir, who went over to Rome on a pilgrimage, and he caught malaria, and he was having a very kind of disturbed vision due to the malaria, and he was taken up on the back of a winged beast high above, and he looked down, and there was a hellish fiery pit, and it was Smithfield, or Smoothfield as it was known then. It was known as the Smoothfield because that's where they take their horses, and you can still see the horse trough there. The horse trough is still there. So it'd be a place where then it became horse trading, and later Bartholomew's Fair, which we can go into, which ran for 700 years, referred to in Oliver Twist, Charles Dickens. And yes, so Ray here had this vision, and he's taken up high above this hellish pit where he saw a fire below, and he thought of that what took him up it was a dragon. Interestingly, the dragon became the symbol of the city of London. So there's some kind of prophecy going on, which they don't really acknowledge. They say that he was taken up on the back of the winged beast. This is his own record, which you can look it up. Actually, it's a thing called the Book of the Foundation of St. Bartholomew's the Great. You can find it on the internet. It's very interesting, and it's all in Old English, obviously. So it's quite wordy. And he's taken up on the back of a dragon, which he believes is Satan, looks down into the fiery hellish pit, which is Smithfield. And then Bartholomew appears to him. Saint Bartholomew appears to him and said, I am Bartholomew. I have come to help thee in thy straits. You will build a church and hospital for the poor in this place. You are the minister and I am the master. Everything will be looked after. He went to the king, told him about the vision, and that's the story behind the church. And it was a priory church, so there was monks there. So it was a church hospital for the poor, founded in 1123, and then several hundred years later, his prophetic dream comes true. It turns into a fiery, hellish pit. So that's not really acknowledged in the story, but it's obvious from the timeline that that's what happened, right?
That's very weird. Well, I mean, I might be going off the track a little bit, but you said about plague pits. I don't know if you know the hairnet building, as what it's called, to Cannon Street. Have you ever seen it? It looks like a hairnet over the top of it. It was built in the early 70s.
Yes.
Well, I work for the structural engineers and architects that actually designed that place. And when I started work, this happened obviously before when I was at school, but when I started work, the engineers, the old boys there, and the architects were talking about this plague pit. And apparently, what happened is, I think it's about must have been 73, 74, something like that. Bulldozers working away. They kept digging up bones and skeletons. So they called Scotland Yard in, who came along and said, no, hang on, that's a plague pit. And the whole area was cordoned off, and the blokes with the noddy suits went in, because what they used to do with plague pits is put lime over the top to kill the plague. But it was happening so badly that they didn't always line the pits or do it properly. And apparently the reason they cordoned it off and got the blokes with the noddy suits in is the plague could still be alive under there and start another bubonic plague. And they chaps that, blokes who are operating the tractors and whatever, they all had to be checked over, because it was quite concerning. And they said, well, it must have been lying because it was all okay. And this is really sick, very sick. One of the quantity surveyors wanted a skull as a souvenir. And everybody went, oh, sick bastard.
Well, it's kind of the opposite of what you should do, really. I mean, it's interesting that there's plague pits all over there, and Islington as well. All on the outskirts.
I mean, this happened before I started work. But, I heard about it.
It's interesting. They've done a lot of excavation next to St. Bartholomew's the Great, and they've dug down about 20, 30 feet there to put these foundations. I never thought they'd do this. So the whole area has been re-engineered, but the centre of Smithfield, as it was, is very much the same as when the burnings happened there. That central part of Smithfield, it's the stake is on the traffic island in the middle, opposite the Bartholomew's entrance. So they would bring the heretics out from that entrance, or they would either be brought through that entrance, or they would come in up Giltspur Street in front of all the crowds. Now, sometimes the heretics were kept in Bartholomew's Close at the back, because they were there with priests generally who were trying to get them to abjure their heretical beliefs. And if you abjured your heretical beliefs, you would then have to carry a bunch of sticks, which is what they burnt people with. They called it a faggot then, which was basically a faggot of sticks, a big thing on your shoulder, right? So it's not Graham Norton. It's got
a faggot on my shoulder. So it's got it on funny photos.
We have to put a bit of humour in, don't you?
I just thought of Tony Blair. Sorry, with the word faggot.
I mean, it's kind of But the point is that they would have to sort of carry this bunch of sticks with them on their shoulder into the church. It's very humiliating. So they would publicly parade them when they abjured. But what was interesting, one of our characters is actually Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, who actually tried two of the heretics. I mean, he was involved in the Anne Askew case, and also with the Friar Forest case. But what happened was, when Cranmer took issue with the crown and the papacy, he was charged with heresy. And what happened was that he actually abjured, and then they took him to it's at St Mary's Church in Oxford, and he got up in front of the congregation, and it was meant to be, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, I'm sorry, you're great, I'm an idiot, etc. And he got up and he said, everything that I've signed before today is null and void. And furthermore, the hand that signed this document, which I now renounce, will be the first into the fire. So he'd already watched 2 priests burn to death, right? He'd already watched 2 of them burning, and he got up and he did that because it was his chance to be let off, but he didn't do it in the end. So he said, this unworthy right hand. We have a brilliant actor playing Thomas Cranmer, and it's very evocative, and he does the final speech because Cranmer is very much part of the Smithfield heretics. Obviously, he was involved in the conviction of 2 of them, in the respect that he was trying to get them to abjure, and he was involved in the ecclesiastical process. Very, very interesting, because you've got Protestants and Catholics here. So because Henry made himself head of the church, and he also wanted a divorce, the Catholics went against him, you see. So then they get Catholics who were considered heretics by the crown. So it's a fascinating thing. And once I started looking into it, I couldn't stop because there's so much history. And of course, one of the main players was Edmund Bonner, Bishop of London, Edmund Bloody Bonner. And we have a great actor playing him. It looks just like Bonner. I never thought we'd find the people who we've got playing him really look like them, you know?
This could be like a feature film, because
yeah, it is, yeah.
Because they were so, as you said quite rightly earlier, they were so educated for that time.
Yeah.
Very educated, because
and to do it justice is very difficult, Chris, because you have to get into the detail and get the story over, but it has to, in a film, it has to be very simplistic. So the film explains things very simply, and they explain what happened to them. Basically, it's obviously their ghosts of the past coming back, but I think that it does them justice in the respect that the stories are accurate, you know. And all right, we've got Bishop Bonner as a baddie, really, but he ended up in prison. You see, he ended up in prison, and then he decided that Mary got him out again. He was in Marshalsea Prison and Fleet Prison. So Edmund Bonner, Bishop of London, was locked up, and then because he went against Henry, and then when Mary came in, of course, it went Catholic again. So he was let out, and he tried another 200 Protestants.
Good.
So, and he's got a really bad press because they said that he sort of whipped them, and he sounds like he had some kind of psychotic problem, actually, when you read about him, but it may be just bad press, you know. But yeah, Edmund Bloody Bonner, and yeah, he figures in it a lot. Yes,
it was that they had no real conscience as such, you know, because when you look at religion, it's turn the other cheek and forgiveness and things like that. But there's no forgiveness at all. They took everything so literal, didn't they? Everything was so in your face, so to speak. But something that is fascinating me is that you've got Smithfield. It was a place, first of all, where people were happy. They had meetings, they had the fairs, they had the horse trading and things like that. Then it became an execution site, and then it became an animal execution place.
Yes, it's always been a place in a way of sacrifice. Yeah.
Now, there seems to be something rather satanic about that.
Well, this is what I found interesting about it in the wider respect, yeah.
You know, it seems very strange that you've got all this to do with death. I mean, we live today, there's a death cult. I think we're ruled by a death cult. They're obsessed with it. And when you look through history, you've got these individual heretics being killed in the most awful ways. Then you go through and you've got the 17th century, you've got Cromwell. Then you come forward a bit more. You've got the First World War where poor sods are going over the top of the trenches, getting killed, mass carnage. And it seems the sort of carnage where they executed, was it 60 or 70 people, then the sort of the way they killed people became more and more efficient until you got up to people like Mao, who wiped out, they reckon, something like 1 billion people. And it all seems to be centered around this death cult where religion might have been used as a sort of an excuse. I don't know. It seems to be very satanic.
Well, I think there's certain elements of pagan ritual in it. I mean, because it is a sacrifice in a way. But what the Roman Church, that you were basically with a heretic, it was a way of cleansing them. So it's kind of, they thought it was the gentlest way you could deal with them. So yeah, being burned to death was kind of, we're letting you off lightly here, you know. It's unbelievable, isn't it?
Can you imagine that today? You know, middle class mummy and daddy would take their little ones in their 4x4 down to Smithfield because there's going to be a public execution. Come on, dear. Oh, look, because all that blood everywhere. Oh,
they'd probably find parking a problem.
Is it the Guardian? Sorry, I should. I'm not taking. I think those people are.
No, it's
you know,
it is unbelievable when you think about it. But what was interesting was that even in prison they got treated really badly. You know, like and they had to pay for their food in prison. So it like they got, you know, and some of them were really, they chained them really heavily. And some of these people were chained standing up for weeks on end. I mean, it was like torture, you know. So I found it fascinating, but I found the people who were doing it fascinating because it was a really rebellious thing to do. And so that's what really interested me, that this network of people who were actually working underground against the Roman Empire. I found it very, very interesting. And this network of people from Antwerp to here, they were lawyers, they were priests, they were people within the church, they were landed gentry. So there was a very interesting network, yeah.
Because Guy Fawkes, it wasn't his real name, it's Guy Fawkes. Oh dear, can't remember it. But Guy Fawkes, for want of a better word, he was actually poisoned when he was in prison deliberately. And when you see his signature, he's in prison, it was shaking. And when he went to be decapitated, he could hardly stand up because they was actually poisoning him in prison deliberately. They did it deliberately so. But it's also sadistic, isn't it? And I think sadism nowadays is more psychological than it is physical.
It's like the old
psychologically.
It's like the old Silent Wars thing. So it's more of a psychological program. Yeah, there was psychology involved in what was going on there, but the outcomes were a bit more extreme. And yeah, I mean, there's been so many executions in Smithfield, and that's what interested me about the place, because it's a small place, but it's got I think it's got the oldest house in London now at the back. And if you go into St. Bartholomew's Church, it really is like going back to the 13th, 14th century. It's quite an amazing church inside, and it's really atmospheric. And Henry VIII actually burned a priest in there.
Really?
What Tyler went in there? What
did they do with? Well, it would have been Mash, I suppose, that left. I mean, were there many people buried under Smithfield at all? Have they found many graves there at all?
There was plague pits there. This is why I was interested, because next door they've done a huge excavation which goes right up to the priory at St. Bartholomew's. It's right up to the window. I don't know how they did it, because the priory grounds have all gone. I was really shocked that they do that, because I thought that would be more protected. But I suppose in the city of London, you know, it's all about progress and development, isn't it?
So, be careful.
How many more glass buildings do you want? Well, how many have you got? You know, yeah.
But how could the play? This is what amazed me. I mean, as I say, I wasn't at work I was still at school when it happened, but I heard from the people that worked at this place that the plague could still be kept alive under the soil. And I'm wondering whether they're taking precautions today. There must be, because you know, the soil is quite warm and warm enough to keep a sort of a plague alive. But it always seems to be an excuse in many ways for sadism, doesn't it? It's all sadistic.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're very cruel tortures and punishments that they inflicted, and yeah, it's the kind of mindset behind them. It's like the hand drawing and quartering thing. I mean, who would think of something like that? I don't think you could think of anything more horrific than that. But that was really about the audience. So people would see that, you'd never forget it. You would never forget something like that. So it's another kind of mind control. That's all it is. But the fascinating thing about that period was that you could be on the right side one minute and on the wrong side the next, depending on whatever you wanted to do, you know.
It sounds like North Korea to me today, because you hear about these people that escaped from North Korea, and if it's true what they say, there's a chap that's saying that there's a chap that was stole just a little piece of rope to sell so he could feed his family, and he was executed, and it's a public execution in front of his family, and they'd execute people for anything. You've got to be on the right. You've got to worship Kim Il-jung and Christianity. There, if they find you with a Bible, you're executed. So it's what you're saying happened in Smithfield is almost like explaining what similar to North Korea today, if it's true what they're saying. You know,
I just found the intellectual arguments behind it very interesting, the ecclesiastical arguments, because what it's about, it's like cloaking reality in a way. So they're trying to intellectualize something which they took ownership of. So Papal Bull Unum Sanctum in 1302 put the world in trust to the Holy Roman Empire until Jesus comes back. That's actually what it was about. Outside the Universal Church, there is absolutely no salvation. There is no salvation outside, which is like communitarianism we were talking about last week with Lark, because basically they create one mindset, and if you're outside that, then you're a heretic, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're a denier. It's very, very simple.
Publicly humiliated.
The thing is, and it's very similar in the respect of benefice as well, because obviously the reformists didn't believe in benefice at all. They said, well, you can't pay to get into heaven, you can't pay to absolve your sins. But the Roman Church says, yes, you can. So a lot of what went on with people like Sawtrey, the first person to be burned, priest from Norfolk in 1401, the first person to be burned under the new ecclesiastical law, Heretico Corrumbendo, which became common law through the crown. The common law writ would be issued by the crown, so then you could be burned by the crown, you see. So that was the interesting that. But what he said was that all of this stuff like pilgrimages, spending loads of money, taking money off the public as benefits should be spent helping and feeding the poor. But that was heretical to the church, you see. That's a threat to their control. So that's what I found really interesting about it, was the different ideologies. But if you look at Unum Sanctum and the Lateran Council of 1215, basically they're saying that there's no salvation outside the universal church.
Wow. And
that anything outside of it is deemed to be heretical, deemed to be basically. It's interesting because you've got the reformists who would say that we are the church, we're the real church, you're the fake church. So that was an interesting thing. So the Roman Church are going, no, we're the church, and the reformists will go, no, we're the church, you're the Antichrist. And that was what a lot of them said before they were burned. And that's what Cranmer said. Thomas Cranmer said that in Oxford, St Mary's Church, before he was burned at the stake in Oxford. He said, and as for the Pope is the Antichrist, which was, I mean, completely over the top. I mean, that speech that he made is absolutely incredible. I mean, the jaws must have been on the floor, you know, because they were expecting him to grovel, and he didn't.
I mean, what guts, what brave.
And then, as I said earlier, he put his hand, he said, this is the hand that wrote the confession, which I now withdraw. Everything written by this hand is unworthy, and this hand will burn first. And he put his hand into the fire first. So he burned his right hand off.
Again.
So that's what interested me about the whole concept with it, because it was so extreme, and the people who were involved in it were pushed into very extreme positions, which I think is the premise of a very good story. Because if you look at the premise of what a film is meant to be, you get an inciting incident. Something happens someone's driving down the road, right? It's called the inciting incident in the film. Something happens. They might see a robbery. They might be involved in something. Their whole life changes at that moment. That's called the inciting incident. So there were so many inciting incidents looking at this stuff that I thought you're kind of spoiled for choice, you know. And because it's kind of complex, I think that's one of the reasons that it hasn't really been covered, and the whole thing has been sort of forgotten about. But yeah, we are making the film, and if people want to support Windows on the World, support us on Patreon, and you get a free copy of the film, and you can come to the screenings, and we're going to have days out in Smithfield. So I've got a lot planned for this film, because I think it's like a really good way of sort of giving people something who listen to the show, and letting them get involved in something, and also be like, we're not asking for any funding for the project, but if you want to support us on Patreon, please do, you know, because you will be part of it. And it's kind of, I'd like to get to a point where we can maybe get some funding to do these historical things, because history's been really wiped out. And I think some of this stuff is very powerful, and it ties into what's happening now. In a very intellectual way, you know, that's what attracted me to it, was that the arguments were intellectual, really. Even though they're talking about very basic things, there was a lot of complexity attached to these issues, which were actually in a way quite simple, you know.
Well, you know, I mean, I had a little bit of humour, a bit of a laugh earlier, but putting that aside, I didn't mean to shall we say, degrade those people, because by virtue of what you've said, I have the utmost respect for them, because the bravery they had was just, and really, when you think about it, if it wasn't for them, perhaps our life we wouldn't be able to say the things we're saying today in many ways. And, you know, they are an example of you know, what humans will go through for their belief. And it's not selfish beliefs, it's for everybody else as well. And you can see history repeating itself time and time again, because we got similar today. Not obviously at such extremes, but, you know, not burning people at the stake. But, you know, we've got, shall we say, you're not allowed to say this, you're not allowed to say that, you're not allowed to look into this, you know, what we tell you is the truth, and you've got to believe that, you know.
Well, it's about belief, it's about faith, you see. So that's why the idea of the climate change religion is quite clever, because it's a faith. It's not about what's true. It's about a faith in a belief system. The new benefice is called sustainable development. It means you will pay for your sins that you're on the earth. And this all came out of a think tank. So it doesn't matter whether it's the think tank or the Roman Church. It's kind of the same thing. So in other words, what you've got now is people paying benefice to absolve themselves of their sins of being on the earth, which is what the Catholic Church were asking for in the Middle Ages. So there's no difference between carbon taxation and benefice. It's the same thing.
Yeah, because I've often said that when you look at the civil service and all these different things, really, the way the civil service work is a kind of you're actually it's a kind of religion unto its own, because nobody makes a decision, and everything is placing the responsibility onto somebody else, and it's a ritual. I mean, for instance, if you have a problem with the Inland Revenue and you write a letter to them, oh no, that went in at the wrong time. You got to do this at this time, do this that time, do this, do that, and it's all ritualized. And
yeah, systems of administration.
Yeah, it's all ritual. You got to you know, you got to show this, do that. For example, you know, with the council tax, that you get a discount if you live in a house on your own. So I sent it through on the computer, and then it had time, date, when I did it, all this, that, and the other. It's all kind of Big Brother is watching you. You know, you got to do this, you got to do that. Again, all ritualized. It's quite amazing. But I mean, do you plan any? I mean, I guess you do plan some future films on historical subjects.
Yes, yeah. This is what I always wanted to do, and we're talking about it now. Actually, so I was just looking at the comments. They're always quite amusing because they're a parallel universe to what we're talking about, but some of them relate to it. You know, yeah. So yeah, I'll put that up again. Support us on our forthcoming feature film. Yes, you can do that, and we're going to have some special screenings. You see, my whole idea of it was that I wanted to create something that is very different from what you'd get in any kind of mainstream, because I'm not putting on Amazon Prime. I'm going to put it out as a DVD and do talks, because I think this could really build up into making more historical films. That was the idea, that we stay completely independent, and it's very difficult to do that with a film. I mean, I spend all my time basically working on Windows on the World stuff and doing this film. It's actually an insane idea to make a feature film on your own. It's an insane thing to do. There's so much work, because you not only have to film it, you have to edit it, you have to script it, and the editing of films is the most important bit. The editor makes the film. You know, I mean, it doesn't matter how good the director is. The director is often actually assisted greatly by a cinematographer. So the cinematographer will actually choose the locations, and you know, you got location people. But what we did was did the whole thing off the cuff while people were walking about in broad daylight. You know, we did. so we've got our ghosts
doing that in front of the camera, and I bet you do get.
No. In Smithfield, it's actually very quiet. We went down there Sunday mornings, and there's not many people about, so it's very quiet on a Sunday. And even the taxi drivers were quite respectful when we had Annie Askew walking into the middle of the road where she was burned, and the girl who played it, she's just in a white dress, she's coming back as a ghost, and she stood there. What happened was very strange, actually, because she got into the middle of the road, and her dress just blew all the way, like from both sides. It was flapping from both sides, and her hair was just going all over the place. And she said her feet started burning. And she didn't know much about the history of the place. So it was quite interesting that there is some kind of, I think there's some kind of supernatural thing going on there, but you have to tune into it. Allegedly, if you go down there in the early hours of the morning, you can smell burning wood. So we went down there in the early hours of the morning. This was a few years ago. And we were down there with a friend of mine and his son. And his son was a teenager at the time, and he was very stroppy, you know, and he was carrying around a monopod, which is basically like like a stick, really, and with a camera on the end. And then he had the light on top of the camera. So he was carrying this thing, and it looked like a gun. And I said, don't carry it like that. Don't carry it like that. It looks like you're carrying a weapon, right? Don't do that. Within 5 minutes, we've got City of London helicopter up, haven't we? And we're under this store at the back of St. Bartholomew's Church, with this thing going above, going brrr, and it was there for about 10 minutes, you know. And I think they actually took our pictures, because when we went back into the City of London, a car followed us, and he sped off. I mean, it's kind of interesting, the city, because we also had this at the Grocers Hall. I took a picture of Semiramis, the old, Semiramis, Nimrod, and baby and Tammuz. These were these ancient Babylonian gods, you know, and they used the Semiramis. They used her on, I think, the coffee as well, isn't it? It's I think it's her. It looks like Semiramis. It's a woman with very long hair. You know, it could be anybody, I suppose.
Is it Starbucks? Or?
Starbucks, yeah, they use it. So there's a bust of her on the side of the Grocers Hall. So we went to film it, and a fella came out filming us with his camera like this, just staring at us, following us for ages with his camera. He's shouting at, what are you? So they want to know who you are in the City of London. It's the most protected place on the planet, basically.
Well, it's a separate country, isn't it? It's not part of Great Britain.
Separate jurisdiction. Yeah, it's outside. So you've got places that are, say, you've got Farringdon. You've got places that are within Farringdon and without Farringdon. So you've got some of the churches are within Farringdon, some of them without Farringdon. So it's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons I wanted to film there, really, because I think it'll stay the same for quite some time. That little bit, I don't think I'm going to do anything with that. But the surrounding area is what they've built up right next to the Bartholomew's Church. I didn't think they'd do that, because you've got St Bartholomew's the Great, built in 1123. Then you've got Bartholomew's the Less, which was bombed during the war. And they've now got very Templar orientated kind of Holy Grail stained glass windows in there. It's quite interesting. And we've been in there many times. Yeah, that's St Bartholomew's the Less, which is at the back of St Bartholomew's Hospital. And of course, the statue of Henry VIII is still there at St Bart's.
Really?
And yeah, we feature that in the film. And it's probably one of the only statues of Henry there is, because he was very unpopular. And we used that statue in the film.
Oh, copper.
But yeah, the filming. I started getting involved with this about 2016, really, and we did some things that were put on YouTube. And I always wanted to do this. So yeah, if people want to support it, go to Patreon and help us out. And it's going to be a very exciting project. And everyone will get invited to screenings and doing talks on it. I want to get the characters to come along, so they're going to dress up. It'll just make it, it's. I suppose I was going to say it can't all be doom and gloom, but well, it is about doom and gloom, really. So I suppose it's interesting and inspiring at the same time. I think.
The thing is, though, is that if you come forward in time, it becomes easy, because you can just do set shots. So you're doing something, I don't know, First World War trench. Well, that would be easy peasy, wouldn't it, really? But going way back in history like that, it must be very, very difficult. But isn't it fascinating when you look around? I mean, I used to work, as I say, at in the on the project, the Billingsgate project, and I worked in some site offices there. They turned them into drawing offices, and it was a fantastic view. I had probably the best view in London. I looked over the side of my drawing board. Right in front of me was Tower Bridge, and to the right of me was the River Thames, and it was quite incredible. But it always felt very creepy there. There was something about the City of London that is unlike any other place I've ever been to.
I think it's
very satanic. And also, have you seen that what they call the Dracula building? That's very satanic as well. But why is it that after World War II in Europe, especially in, I think it was Warsaw, they rebuilt Warsaw as it was before it was bombed, and they got craftsmen in to rebuild the buildings? What did they do in London? Oh, sod that, and build a load of 1960s sort of amnesia architecture buildings. And
yeah, but there's still a lot of really old buildings there. I mean, what I find fascinating is that you can find these little alleyways there that are so ancient that you can't go very far without bumping into concrete and glass. But what the old stuff there is very interesting. I've been into most of the churches in the City of London. A really interesting one is St Andrew's in the Wardrobe, which is right at the back. And sometimes you think, God, I can't remember where that is now, because the City of London's changed so much around Cannon Street and all around there. They've put up more and more buildings. It's quite disorientating now. But I used to walk through there a lot, because I always thought it was full of secrets, and it's got that history about it. You can go to those little inns and you look at these little back streets and these little courts that are around. It's absolutely fantastic history, and I'd like to do much more on that. And the Smithfield thing,
and the secret
it's been a long time in coming. But yeah, the City of London run by 25 aldermen in 25 wards. So basically, each one is run by an alderman. You've got 25 wards of the City of London, and they control everything. I mean, it is fascinating. fascinating place. Yeah.
Well, I actually, when I very first started work, one of the first things I had to do, I had to go down to the fish market and stunk of fish. Billingsgate, that's right. And I had to hold the staff whilst the surveyor did the old bits and bobs, even though I wasn't a surveyor. And the amazing thing about the city is that it's really easy to survey because the Victorians put little markers on the walls of how high above, what's that place in Cornwall? There's a level of sea level, which is 0, so to speak. And it's in Cornwall. I can't think of the name of the damn place now. And you could take your levels from these markers. The Victorians are absolutely brilliant like that, and it was really incredible. You know, you had to get the old theodolite right, and I learned about surveying because that's part of architecture. You got to learn so much about all different things. And what got me about the fish market there, it was the time when the winos used to help to push the fish trolleys up the hill, and there's all these old winos there that blokes used to pay, but the place absolutely stunk like hell. Poor. I mean, when you left, you know, I was there for a couple of hours helping this chap to do the surveying, and poor, that's absolutely awful stink, you know. But no, that's all moved up. Obviously, that's all gone now. It's all cleaned up, and you know, I found that it was again, it was fascinating because there's so much old stuff there. For example, do you know the bollards were the cannons from I think it was the Battle of Waterloo. I think it was Battle of Waterloo. Could be wrong. Well, so hang on. No, I think it was the what was the Charge of the Light Brigade in? That was the Battle of. That was the oh dear, 1840s.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the battle.
But yeah, the actual bollards are from those cannons, and they've got the cannonball on top. So if you go around the city, and you'll see cannonball on top of cannons and things like that. But it's a fascinating place. I mean, the surveying again was a doddle because the Victorians have got all these markers, so you knew exactly where you went, you know, where you was going. Where normally you would have to sort of pick on some level area and just start from that as your datum point. But all the datum points are already laid out. But they say it's a square mile, and they say it's very small, but it is quite an area actually to walk it. You know, the square.
Well, I think what it is, there's a lot in it. There's a lot actually there. You know, you can spend a couple of weeks really going around it, because if you do it properly, there's a lot to see. I mean, that area around St. Paul's is very interesting. You've got the temple. I mean, I was around the Inns of Court the other week, which is just outside the City of London, really, but it starts in the city, doesn't it? And, you know, you've got the Middle Temple, outside you've got Lincoln's Inn Fields and the St. Martin's in the Fields, out, you know. Then you've got where the Middle and Inner Temple, where the Templar Church is. And that's a really interesting place as well. So, yeah, I'd recommend anyone going looking around there. And what I was going to do was do a walk down there. And so we could go down there maybe on an evening when we put the film out. You know, I wanted to do some events, really, because I think this could be such a fascinating thing. There's more and more people contacted me about it. You know, I've found people who know a bit of history here and there. The thing is with it, it's only ever been really covered by academics who are basically just reading from the hymn sheet. They're just saying, oh, and this happened and it's all stuff they've just read. There's no insight into what actually happened, and they're not very good at joining dots. So in other words, like it's like the Rahia story. You'll hear, oh yes, and he was taken up on the back of a dragon, and he saw this terrible sight, and say, you know, but they won't put two and two together and go, well, wait a minute, the dragon became the symbol of the City of London when it was incorporated, and then it doesn't look at the fiery hellish pit, which was where they burned people. They don't want to say these sort of things. You see, the little things they just won't put together. They just this one, it's called Medieval Slaughterfield, and the title's quite good, but the film's terrible. And it's got bits of Braveheart, and it's got William Wallace being brought in like this, like as though it's almost like a crucifixion. That didn't happen. He was dragged there. You know, they dragged him behind horses. I mean, the whole thing is they never get it right. Even in the Tudors, I think they featured Annie Askew, but they never get it right. They don't get the feel of the thing right, or the real kind of the story. The story is generally glossed over. So that's what I wanted to bring to this film, something that's quite simple to explain, but the characters, like Friar Forrest, has never really been given an outing. You know, the people talk about him. He got a bad press in Fox's Book of Martyrs because he was Catholic. But in actual fact, I mean, they say, he was. They basically called him a coward because because his feet were in the fire and he was trying to get out. But that's a reflex action, right? You can't blame him for that. Like, he didn't stand there and get burned to death like the rest of them, you know. But most of them were chained. You see, they couldn't move. So it's
let's face it, it works. I think it's a natural reaction to want to get out, wouldn't it? Really?
Yeah. But yeah. So I thought it was good to give Friar Forrest, and we've got a very good actor. One of our viewers, actually, a friend of mine for years, Des, is playing Friar Forrest, and Joan Boach is played by another friend of mine, Joanne, and we've got Annie Askew by my friend Araya, and then we've got Thomas Cranmer, who was a friend of a friend, and he's brilliant. And we went down there to film him as a ghost and all that, and that's when Netflix were filming this. That he filmed, you know, it was very exciting, the whole project really, and it's all been done. You know, what the amazing thing about this is, right, is that you can make something look like $1 million if you know what you're doing. You can shoot something on a small camera. You can shoot on a good camera, basically on the hoof with a couple of actors. And if you know your locations and what you want, you can make it look like a big budget movie. And that's what I love about the technology now. And it's not used. You know, like there's so many good places and so many good locations that can be used. And look at the crap they put on TV. You know, it's just turned out quickly and it's rubbish. Some of the dramas are quite good. They spend a lot of money on, but they don't seem to get very. It's cutting edge stuff we want. You know, that's the whole idea of the film, is that it's a bit quirky, it's different. It's kind of got a slightly supernatural element to it, which makes it a bit mystery, you know, because you want a bit of that. You want something that draws you in on a number of levels, because that's what drew me into Smithfield on a number of levels, because I had a few experiences down there and had some kind of insights into what had gone on. And I kept going there. I just walked up there on Sunday. Thought, I've got to do something here, you know. And yeah, it's fascinating. And that meat market is still there. I think they start about 3 o'clock in the morning. It's all over by about 10 in the morning. I think the meat market. Have a look at it anyway. I think they've changed the times, but they're not doing it as much now. And of course, everyone's going to be vegan soon and not driving, so they'll probably close it all down.
I used to walk past there going to work in the morning, because I used to walk. Where did I used to walk from? I used to come down on the mainline station. Anyway, I can't remember. And used to see carcasses hanging outside in a sort of diesel engine. Yeah, like boom, boom, boom. There's all sort of like diesel stains up the back of the car.
There's a really good film, Chris. I can't remember what it's called, but I've got a copy of it. I think it's on YouTube, and I think it was made in the 80s. And it's really funny. They're throwing big bits of meat at each other. It's just really yobby and very, very funny at the same time. Oh, yeah. And this woman goes to work there, and there's she gets bullied so much, and she can't keep up with the banter, and they're just giving her these awful jokes all day long. So basically, she says, "Oh, I can't stand it anymore. I'm going to leave." They're all like a bunch of kids, you know. It's a very good documentary about Smithfield and about the way they are down there, you know. So you've got all that going on. Yeah, so it is an interesting place. And of course, the drovers used to bring the cattle down. They used to go hundreds of miles for these cattle. They used to bring them down from places like Scotland, obviously stopping off for weeks on the way, right? You know what I mean? But they'd bring them all down what is the A10 now. They'd bring them down that way.
The geese, they used to bring them in from Norfolk, didn't they? They used to take them down. But when, you know, it's funny, going back to this Billingsgate, there seems to be a link with Billingsgate, because as I say, one of my first jobs I had to do was to go and to help a surveyor going around Billingsgate. And then several years later, in the early 90s, I was actually worked on the Billingsgate redevelopment. And I was the architectural bloke. If you look at that horrible, you know, that pyramid building that's all glass. Well, the
Yeah.
top three floors.
Shard. You don't know the shard's elsewhere, isn't it?
That's not the shard.
No.
This is it's a kind of a greeny blue colour glass, and it was Citibank was our client. I worked for Coble Matthews, and it was one of the best projects I ever worked on. Actually, I was freelance there, and it was great. And I, as I say, I had the best view out of an office window you could ever have. And what the senior architect there, what he did, he said, right, he carved it up so you had 3 floors at the top. I was an architectural technician. One technician had that. Then you'd liaise with the bloke who does the other floors down below, and then you liaise with somebody else like that. And of course, I can't stay at heights. So guess what I got? Because I was contract, the top floors. And I also, as when I'd actually finished off that top, we looked into the basement, which was very interesting. Stunk of fish, and they took all because there was actually ice from the Victorian times, like permafrost down there, which they took out, and it helped to waterproof it. And if you went down there to survey it, you had to look to see if there's a spring tide, because it could be quite dangerous, you know, if you went down there. And it was very damp and it stunk. But we found that there was some hidden rooms that have been blocked up in the Victorian times, because we had these old drawings or copies of them from the 1880s, 70s, around like that. And we said, hang on a minute, let's see if we could find anything in these rooms. And we got some navvies to open it up. And got the office junior to crawl through with a lamp and everything. And all he found was a winkle picker shoe from the 60s. And we thought, hang on a minute, if that was blocked up in the sort of 1900s, how did a winkle pickle shoe get there? And that was a mystery.
Wow.
And you know,
I don't know.
I solved the mystery.
Go on.
I've had a picture of my granddad's brother before the First World War, wearing a collarless jacket like the Beatles, because he's a bit of a snappy dresser, and a pair of winkle picker shoes. They were fashionable.
Well, that's right. I was going to say it could have been the Paul McCartney that disappeared, you see.
It could be. But I mean, I've got lots of...
Yeah, I don't want to get into that. I find, you know what's so annoying? We put out really, really cutting edge stuff in the respect of what's going on politically and all this psychological programming that's going on, the hive mind. And I think the biggest hitter we've ever had is who is Paul McCartney, is whether Paul McCartney was replaced, which I couldn't care less about anyway. You know,
it's funny that, isn't it? You know, but I think that you're on a winner with these films. You really are.
Well, it's I don't think there's people doing it. See, the thing is that there's not many people willing to just spend so much time on something that the thing is with these small films, you don't get money back really. Amazon have really ruined it in a way, because Amazon Prime, I had a film up there, it's about Jet Harris from The Shadows, and you can still get it on the website. And it's a very good film. If you're into early 60s stuff, have a look. There's 2 films. There's one called Backstage Pass, and there's one that's about Jet Harris. He was a real rebel. He was in the Shadows in the early 60s, and he had his hair peroxided, sort of James Dean type character, but very funny bloke as well. And we made a film with him just before he died, and he was really rebellious, you know, till the end. And he's
brilliant guitarist as well.
Yeah, but he was a kind of interesting character as well, because I wasn't a Shadows fan to start with, because I remember I couldn't stand Cliff Richard, but the actual band are brilliant. They were fantastic musicians, the Shadows. I mean, and the production, if you go back to their early albums, they're absolutely fantastic production. Even today, listen to it. It's astonishing stuff, you know. Apache, you know, it's a great video of Jet playing Apache, and he's got the winkle. It ends on the winkle picker shoe, and he's smoking. He's on the bass. And and it's all film noir, you know. It's all like that. And at the end, he just goes, and then you just see him crushing it in his winkle picker, you know.
Oh, brilliant! Because the Shadows were good. They were very good. Apache was pretty good, and but they did say, what was it now? One of them said, I think Cliff outgrew us or something. I don't know whether they parted because of that, but I think I don't know whether it was a friendly parting or not. But they sort of, he said something which could be interpreted in either way. I don't know, but I can't say.
Well, it's not. I'm not a great fan of him, but it's in actual fact the early stuff was very good. Move It was brilliant, but I think Jet was still with them then. But we go on to different stuff now,
Yeah. I mean, Move It. I mean, I've got a much older sister than me, and I was always the kid brother. She hated my guts. She still hates my guts. I haven't spoken to her for years, and her wall was full. I always remember when I was really young of pictures of Cliff Richards. She was a Cliff Richards. She idolised him, or what was his name? Harry Webb.
Harry Webb.
Yeah, because he used to live at Nazing, and his mother remarried, and I think his stepfather was younger than him. Something weird like that, because he was, wasn't he? He was.
Well, we're getting onto a different subject there, but yeah, the thing is, I put that on Amazon Prime, and the company, which is called an aggregator called Distributor, they went bankrupt, and so I'm left now with that. The film's sort of in limbo. I'm still seeing if I can download it, but yeah, that's the problem with all this stuff. I mean, the good thing is that I wanted to do with this film. I'm going to put it out for people who listen to the show. Anyone who supports us on Patreon, I'll put the banner up again. It's not a salesman thing, but basically, if you want to help us, please do. The point is that we're going to put this out, and it's going to be like part of a community effort. Really, it's the Windows on the World community. It's like there's going to be events that are going to be of interest to people who listen to the show, and you'll get a copy of the film and be invited to the screenings. So I think there's some really interesting stuff that can happen from it. And also, we have a lot of really good contacts now all over the country for our Talks the Bigger Picture. We're in Frome and Totnes this weekend. Look on windowsontheworld.net and come along if you're down there. And if you want to book us for talks, get in touch with us through the website. Yeah. So I'm probably going to wrap this up in a minute, Chris, because I think we've had a good wrap tonight.
Very pretty good one. I'll tell you something else, Mark. The City of London. I know it's a bit of an old cliche, but Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, we could get into that. Hanway Street is a place I used to go to quite a lot. We used to go to a little curry place down there, just off Brick Lane, and that's where some of the I think there's a few of them that took place down there. Yeah, that's a different story altogether.
Shall we say? I think there's a lot of, shall we say, fake information about it, but that again is another subject. But
absolutely, yeah, we can't get into that. But yeah,
around the City of London, it is easier to film, but also the English Civil War that time, that's quite interesting as well. Cromwell and that, because people don't really know the truth about Cromwell.
No,
and
there's plenty in Smithfield that they don't know about. I mean, like, there's Wat Tyler, the peasants' revolt ended there when Wat Tyler met with the mayor and the king, and they said that Wat Tyler was lunged at one of them. I don't think that happened at all. I think they just did him in front of his own followers, a bit like what they're trying to do with heretics, trying to scare the public. So Wat Tyler was wounded, ran into the church. The church didn't accept him. They dragged him into the hospital and they murdered him in the hospital. So it's Smithfield, very interesting place, and we'll be doing more on this in the weeks to come because there's so many stories, and it's a little bit different from the stuff that we usually talk about, but in a way, I think it's very relevant when you've got things like the Act of 6 Articles, which was formally known, which came 1539, which the formal title was an act abolishing diversity in opinions. So I think that's pretty much where we are now with the censorship and what's going on. So it kind of runs parallel in some ways. But thanks everyone for listening, and be back on Sunday 9 p.m. I'll be with you, I think, tomorrow night, won't I?
Yes, it'll be with me tomorrow night at 7 o'clock.
7 p.m. Okay.
So, and also I'll be on at 9:30. A busy day tomorrow. 9:30 in the morning with Caroline, and we're going to sort of look at whether they could phase out David Attenborough to help the climate. And
yeah, well, I was listening to some of our Greater Thunderbird versus David Attenborough sketches last night, and they are pretty good.
At 7 o'clock tomorrow night, Eric von Essex. So, sorry, a little plug there, but good luck with these films. I'm really fascinated with these films, Mark. I think you're on a winner here. Somebody put in
It's something that this stuff's getting forgotten about, you see, and I think that it's important that there's people out there who are interested in this stuff. So yeah, and it's not the obvious, is it? You know, it's not doing something that's the obvious. So I think
of the Russian saying, an old Russian saying is, in order to look forward, you need to keep one eye looking into the past.
Yes, absolutely. I've just put it up again there. Support us and our forthcoming feature film, The Heretics of London, on Patreon at windowsontheworld.net. So there you go. We don't do many plugs, but why not? Okay, that's great. So join us tomorrow night if you're about. And thanks a lot for watching, and thanks for the comments. Hello to Steve Watson and Lark and Sandy123 and all the rest of you in the comments. I'll just have a quick look. So yes, Cromwell helped orchestrate the killing of the King's ritual that led to the execution of Charles I. That was Lark in Texas. Yeah, his handlers were wealthy Jewish merchant bankers in Amsterdam. Yeah, well, that's another story. Very interesting stuff, all this, because and how we had when we get into the House of Orange and all that, fascinating stuff. Yeah, great stuff. Thanks for watching, everybody. We've gone a bit over time, but I think it was quite interesting.
Thanks for having me on. Much appreciated. Thank you.
See you in a bit. Good night.